The morning fog rolled lazily across the coastal town of Carmel-by-the-Sea, California. Blankets of heavy mist, wrapping themselves around the rustic, storybook cottages and towering cypress trees that defined the wealthy enclave. Inside the grand, polished marble lobby of the Whispering Pines Resort, one of the most exclusive luxury destinations on the Pacific coast, the atmosphere was thick with quiet opulence and the gentle clinking of porcelain from the breakfast terrace. This peaceful facade was abruptly shattered by a sharp, echoing shout that caused dozens of wealthy tourists to look up in unison from their newspapers and gourmet coffees. "Get that old man out of here right now. He is ruining the atmosphere and frightening our VIP guests." The voice belonged to Samuel Fletcher, the hotel's long-serving general manager. A man whose entire identity was wrapped up in his tailored suits, his meticulously trimmed mustache, and the rigid code of elitism he used to run the property. Samuel stood near the front desk, his face flushed with irritation as he pointed a trembling finger toward a leather armchair tucked into a quiet alcove. Sitting in that armchair was a man who looked entirely out of place in the multi-million-dollar resort. He appeared to be around 75 years old, his white hair unkempt and windblown, his jacket worn thin at the elbows, and the cuffs of his trousers stained with damp earth. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of manual labor, shook noticeably against his knees. His eyes, a pale, faded gray-blue, stared blankly at the floor, clouded by a thick fog of deep confusion and exhaustion, as if he had no understanding of what town he was in, let alone how he had stumbled into this sanctuary of wealth. For the past 2 hours, wealthy patrons had walked right past him, pulling their silk scarves tighter and averting their gaze, treating him as though he were entirely invisible. Nobody moved to help him, and nobody offered him so much as a word of comfort. Nobody, that is, except Sarah Harrison. Sarah was a 24-year-old housekeeper who had been on her shift for barely 40 minutes when she first noticed the old man. Unlike the guests and her fellow staff members who looked away in disgust, Sarah felt a sharp pang of empathy pierce her chest. Leaving her heavy cleaning cart discreetly against the wall, she began to walk slowly toward the alcove, her footsteps quiet on the thick wool rugs so as not to startle the fragile man. As she approached, she saw that his lips were severely chapped and cracked from dehydration, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The old man slowly lifted his head, his cloudy eyes blinking as he tried to focus on the young woman kneeling down in front of him, bringing herself right to his eye level. "Are you all right, sir?" Sarah asked softly, her voice filled with a gentle warmth that was entirely foreign to the cold, transactional nature of the luxury resort. The old man tried to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped his throat. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking painfully as he managed to whisper a single word. "Water. Please. Just a little water." Sarah didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She stood up, walked swiftly past the judgmental glares of the front desk staff, and retrieved a glass of ice-cold water from the lobby bar. When she returned, the old man reached out with both hands, but they shook so violently that the water threatened to spill all over his worn clothes. Sensing his distress, Sarah placed her own steady hands over his, gently guiding the glass to his lips and helping him take slow, measured sips. "Slow down, sir. Take your time," she murmured softly, her genuine care contrasting brutally with the rigid environment surrounding them. It was precisely at this moment that Samuel Fletcher marched out from his glass-walled office, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the marble floor. Seeing his employee comforting the intruder, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You!" Samuel barked at Sarah, his voice dripping with venom. "What on earth do you think you are doing? This is a 5-star international resort, not a downtown homeless shelter. Get this vagrant off the property immediately before I call the local authorities." Sarah stood up slowly, smoothing down her uniform, but she did not step back. She looked the manager directly in the eye, her posture radiating a quiet, unyielding firmness. "He isn't a vagrant, Mr. Fletcher," she replied, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. He is a human being who is clearly disoriented, severely dehydrated, and in desperate need of medical attention. Samuel crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with arrogant authority. I don't give a damn what he needs, Harrison. He is ruining the image we project to our clientele. Look at how the guests are staring at us right now. He gestured angrily toward a group of European tourists near the concierge desk, who were indeed watching the scene unfold, though their expressions were not filled with fear, but rather with a profound, quiet curiosity. Standing on the sweeping grand staircase just above the lobby, a tall man dressed in an impeccable, custom-tailored dark navy suit froze mid-step. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, handsome face bore the heavy weight of a man who made million-dollar decisions before breakfast. This was David Sterling, the 36-year-old billionaire owner of the Whispering Pines resort chain. David was one of the most successful and ruthless real estate moguls in the United States, commanding a vast empire of luxury properties and shipping lines, with a personal fortune estimated well north of $500 million. He was known across the country for his massive, cold-hearted efficiency in corporate takeovers. Yet he maintained a massive philanthropic foundation that donated millions to national charities, a public generosity that stood in stark contrast to his complete, icy estrangement from his own family. David had come down to the lobby to inspect the final details of a new oceanfront restaurant opening, but something about the commotion below caught his attention. It wasn't the manager's loud voice, nor was it the murmurs of the crowd. It was the faint, raspy sound of the old man's voice, echoing lightly off the high ceilings. Something about that specific cadence, the unique, broken way the man pronounced his words, sent an inexplicable, icy shiver down David's spine. He began to walk down the remaining stairs slowly, keeping his presence quiet, as he watched the confrontation from a short distance. This man needs a doctor, not to be humiliated and thrown out into the cold morning air, Sarah insisted, her voice rising slightly to match Samuel's hostility. Look at his hands, Mr. Fletcher. He has been sitting here for hours, completely lost, and not a single soul in this building bothered to ask if he was okay. Samuel's eyes narrowed into slits. That is not my problem, and it certainly isn't yours. Your job is to clean rooms and maintain the resort's standard, and that standard does not include beggars resting in our leather furniture. Call security to have him removed immediately. Sarah took a deep breath, her chin lifting with a determination that shocked the manager. No, sir, I will not do that. Samuel gasped, completely taken aback by the open defiance. Excuse me? Are you openly insubordinate to me, Miss Harrison? Let me remind you that you work at my discretion, and I can fire you this very second, without a single dime of severance, if you continue this ridiculous attitude. Sarah felt the terrifying weight of the threat pressed down on her shoulders. She was a 24-year-old single mother, raising a 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, entirely on her own. This housekeeping job was the only source of income that allowed her to pay the high rent on their tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. Losing this job didn't just mean losing a paycheck. It meant losing the health insurance that covered Chloe's expensive, life-saving chronic asthma medications. But as she turned her head to look back at the old man, whose pale blue-gray eyes were filled with a sadness so deep it looked like a lifetime of total abandonment, her heart overrode her fear. She made a choice that would permanently alter the course of her life. Then go ahead and fire me, Mr. Fletcher, she said, her voice completely devoid of hesitation. But I will not stand by and watch a human being suffer in front of me when I have the power to help him. Samuel opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of furious words. But before he could speak, a deep, authoritative baritone voice cut through the air like a knife. What exactly is happening here? David Sterling stepped into the center of the alcove, his presence immediately commanding the room. Samuel Fletcher turned completely pale, his arrogant posture instantly collapsing into a frantic, bowing sycophancy. Mr. Sterling, sir, please accept my deepest apologies for this unsightly disturbance. I was just in the middle of ensuring this individual was removed from the premises. so our guests wouldn't be inconvenienced," Samuel stammered, his hands sweating as he wiped them against his trousers. David didn't even look at the manager. His intense gaze was locked entirely on the face of the old man sitting in the chair. He stared at the trembling hands, the worn clothes, and most of all, those pale blue-gray eyes that seemed to be searching for something through a thick fog of cognitive decline. A sudden, violent wave of vertigo hit David, making the solid marble floor beneath his feet feel as though it were tilting dangerously. There was something hauntingly, terrifyingly familiar about that gaze. "What is your name, sir?" David asked, his voice suddenly losing its corporate sharpness as he slowly knelt down on the floor, adopting the exact same humble posture Sarah had taken just minutes before. The old man blinked heavily, his mind struggling to pierce through the confusion as he looked at the billionaire's face. "Dan," the man whispered, his voice cracking with immense effort. "My name is Daniel." David felt his chest tighten so hard he could barely draw breath. Daniel was a common name, a standard American name. There was absolutely no logical, rational reason for it to affect him this deeply. Yet, a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Daniel what? What is your last name?" David pressed, his voice strained and slightly altered by an emotion he couldn't name. But the old man couldn't answer. The brief moment of clarity had vanished, and his eyes drifted back toward the floor, completely exhausted by the simple interaction. Sarah, seeing that the old man was reaching the absolute limit of his physical endurance, stepped forward courageously. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, this man needs immediate medical care. He is severely dehydrated, malnourished, and profoundly confused. We need to get a doctor to examine him before we ask him any more questions." David looked up at Sarah, really seeing her for the very first time. There was something about the absolute conviction in this young housekeeper's eyes, the direct, fearless way she spoke to him without a shred of the trembling fear everyone else showed him, that earned his immediate, deep respect. "You're right," David said, standing up and turning his sharp gaze onto the manager. "Fletcher, call Dr. Reynolds immediately. Have him brought up to the executive penthouse suite on the top floor, not the lobby clinic. Move him now." Samuel's jaw dropped in utter bewilderment. "But Mr. Sterling, sir, we don't even know who this man is. He could be dangerous, he could be a criminal, he could—" "I said call the doctor, Fletcher," David interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that silenced the manager instantly. "And you," David added, turning back to Sarah, "I want you to accompany him up to the suite. You seem to be the only person in this entire resort who understands how to treat a human being with basic dignity." Sarah nodded quickly, relieved that the old man was finally safe from being thrown out into the cold. As the resort staff brought a wheelchair forward, Sarah gently helped Daniel stand, keeping a firm, reassuring grip on his fragile arm. She could feel how thin he was beneath his dirty clothes, his bones feeling as delicate as glass. As they walked toward the private golden elevators, David remained standing perfectly still in the middle of the crowded lobby. He watched the old man's slouched, defeated back disappear behind the closing elevator doors, his mind trapped in a sudden avalanche of memories he had spent 15 years trying to bury under hundreds of millions of dollars. The sound of that voice. It echoed the voice of his own father, Daniel Sterling, shouting from the porch of their old family farmhouse in rural Ohio, just before everything shattered between them a decade and a half ago. David shook his head violently, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. It was impossible. His father was a proud, stubborn man who owned a modest manufacturing business in the Midwest. There was no way he could be this broken, wandering soul on the coast of California. It had to be a bizarre, cruel coincidence. Yet, as David walked slowly toward the stairs to return to his office, his heart was hammering against his ribs with a terrifying intensity. Up in the executive suite, Dr. Reynolds, a calm, middle-aged physician with wire-rimmed glasses, completed his thorough examination of the old man. He stepped out into the plush hallway where Sarah was waiting anxiously, Her arms crossed over her chest. "How is he, doctor?" she asked immediately. "He is suffering from severe physical exhaustion, advanced dehydration, and clear signs of prolonged malnutrition," Dr. Reynolds explained, adjusting his glasses as he looked over his medical chart. "But the most significant issue is his neurological state. He is exhibiting profound episodes of cognitive disorientation, which appears to be the early to mid stages of dementia. This condition has undoubtedly been worsened by extreme psychological stress and prolonged neglect. He needs continuous hydration, absolute rest, and someone to watch over him constantly for the next few days until we can stabilize his baseline." Sarah nodded, her heart aching for the old man. She knew exactly what it meant for someone to be left alone in a world that was moving too fast to care. "Can I go back in to see him?" she asked quietly. "Yes, he's awake, but please don't push him for answers. Let him speak only if he feels comfortable." Sarah stepped inside the massive suite, which was decorated with an almost suffocating level of luxury: silk curtains, a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, and expansive glass walls offering a breathtaking view of the roaring Pacific Ocean. Daniel was resting against the pillows, a bit of color finally returning to his pale cheeks, though his eyes still held that thick, melancholic fog. "Hello, Mr. Daniel," Sarah said softly, pulling up a chair next to the bed and gently taking his hand. "How are you feeling now?" "Better, my dear, much better," the old man replied, a faint, fragile smile appearing on his face. "Thank you for what you did for me. I don't deserve such kindness from a stranger." "Of course you deserve it," Sarah said firmly. "Every single person deserves to be treated with love and respect, no matter what they look like or what they have in their pockets." Daniel stared at her for a long time, his eyes tearing up as her words seemed to ignite a spark deep within his fractured memory. "That is exactly what I used to tell my boy when he was small," he whispered, his voice cracking with immense sorrow. "I told him that the true measure of a man isn't the size of his bank account, but how he treats the people who can offer him absolutely nothing in return." She thought of her own daughter, Chloe, and the terrifying thought of ever becoming separated from her by time, pride, or misunderstanding. "Do you have a son, Mr. Daniel?" she asked gently. The old man's tears finally spilled over, rolling down the deep valleys of his wrinkled face. He gripped the expensive bed sheets tightly with his rough fingers. "I did," he said, his voice carrying the crushing weight of 15 years of absolute loneliness. "A brilliant, incredibly ambitious boy. He had such a beautiful heart when he was young, but the lure of big business changed him. Or maybe it was me who failed to guide him properly after his mother passed away. We had a horrific argument over the future of our family company. I wanted to preserve our local workers' jobs, but he saw my methods as ancient history. He wanted to sell everything to a multinational corporation. I said unforgivable things to him that night. He said even worse things to me, and then he walked out the door. I haven't heard his voice or seen his face in 15 years. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the details. "Did you ever try to look for him?" she whispered. "So many times," Daniel wept. "But he changed his phone numbers, moved across the country, and as the years marched on, my mind started losing its grip on reality. I began to forget dates, names, faces. My sister, who used to take care of me in Ohio, passed away 2 years ago. Since then, I've been completely alone, wandering from town to town, relying on the kindness of strangers. Sometimes, I don't even know how I get to the places where I wake up." "And how did you end up at this resort today?" Sarah asked. Daniel knit his brows, his mind straining heavily against the darkness of his illness. "I don't know for sure," he admitted honestly. "I remember walking along the highway for miles. I was so incredibly thirsty. Then, I saw the name Sterling, written on a massive stone sign at the entrance of the driveway. Something inside my heart pulled me here. It was as if my feet remembered a truth that my mind had completely forgotten." Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The name of the resort chain was Sterling Luxury Properties, and the owner was David Sterling. Could it truly be possible? She shook her head quickly, trying to dismiss the thought. It was too wild, too cinematic to be real. Yet, the seed of suspicion had been planted deep in her mind, and it began to grow rapidly. She comforted Daniel until he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, and then she quietly stepped out of the room. The moment she closed the heavy wooden door behind her, she found herself face to face with Samuel Fletcher, who was waiting for her, with his arms crossed and an expression of pure malice. "I hope you are fully aware that this little charity act of yours isn't going to save your job," the manager hissed in a low, poisonous whisper. Mr. Sterling made a temporary decision out of sheer, fleeting pity. But the moment he leaves the property tonight, that dirty old man is going back to the street where he belongs, and you will be walking out the door right behind him for daring to disrespect my authority. Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the manager, her voice dropping to a calm, deadly quiet tone. "Do whatever you feel you have to do, Mr. Fletcher. But as long as I am breathing, that man will not suffer another second of your cruel indifference." Samuel clenched his jaw, furious that he couldn't break her spirit, and stormed down the carpeted hallway. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse, and headed down toward the resort's kitchen to order a light, nutritious broth for Daniel. Her mind was spinning out of control. An ambitious son, a massive family business breakup, 15 years of total silence, and the name Sterling. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. Up in his sprawling penthouse office on the top floor, David Sterling was completely incapable of focusing on the multi-million-dollar quarterly financial reports displayed on his computer monitors. The rows of numbers blurred together into a meaningless static as his mind violently pulled him back to the image of the fragile old man in the lobby. He picked up his secure desk phone and dialed a private extension. "Grace," he said, his voice unusually tense as he spoke to his most trusted executive assistant. "I need you to run a highly confidential background check immediately. I want the medical intake information and any identifying markers of the elderly man we brought into the penthouse suite this morning. Use our private security contacts to find out exactly who he is, and I want those results on my desk before the sun sets tonight." After hanging up the phone, David walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the vast expanse of the gray Pacific Ocean. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a massive, dark precipice that he had successfully avoided for over a decade. Grace called back less than 45 minutes later, her voice carrying a professional hesitation that immediately amplified David's anxiety. "Mr. Sterling, I have the preliminary data, but it's highly irregular. The gentleman carried absolutely no identification papers, wallet, or phone when he arrived. However, our security team reviewed the exterior high-definition cameras. He walked onto our property entirely on foot from the coastal highway, alone, roughly 3 hours before he collapsed in the armchair. As for his name, I ran a cross-reference through national health databases and missing persons reports in the Midwest. There is an active file out of Ohio for a Daniel Sterling, aged 76, who disappeared from a residential care facility shortly after his sister's passing 2 years ago. The physical description matches our guest perfectly, sir." David disconnected the call without saying a word. He pressed his palms against his face, feeling the crushing weight of a guilt he had run from for 15 long years. He remembered that final, explosive night in Ohio as if it were yesterday. The look of profound heartbreak on his father's face when David told him he was nothing but an outdated obstacle to true progress, an old man who was no longer needed. He had built a global empire to prove his independence, but standing in his multi-million-dollar office, David realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that his entire life of unparalleled success had been nothing more than an elaborate, desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of his own arrogance. As night fell over Carmel, the Whispering Pines Resort transformed into a wonderland of golden landscape lighting, preparing to host a major black-tie gala for international investors arriving from Tokyo. David was expected to lead the reception, but his soul was trapped on the third floor. Breaking all his rigid corporate protocols, he bypassed the gala preparation and walked down to the suite. Peeking through the small glass pane of the door, he saw Sarah sitting quietly beside the bed, reading a local newspaper aloud in a soft, soothing voice, while Daniel listened with his eyes closed, a serene expression on his face. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said gently, rising to her feet the moment David stepped inside the room. "He is resting much better now. He managed to eat some hot broth and has had several moments of true clarity this afternoon." David nodded slowly, his eyes locked entirely on the sleeping old man. He stepped closer, tracing every deep wrinkle, every strand of white hair, searching for the vibrant, strong father he had left behind 15 years ago. But time, and the harsh reality of living on the streets, had taken a devastating toll. This man looked 20 years older than he should have, physically diminished by neglect. Has he spoken any more about his past?" David asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "He told me he had a manufacturing business and a son he lost after a terrible argument about the company's future," Sarah replied, her steady eyes watching David's face for any sign of confession. "He said he hasn't seen his boy in 15 long years." David felt the ground beneath his feet give way entirely. 15 years, the exact number of years he had carried in his own heart. Suddenly, Daniel stirred against the pillows and slowly opened his eyes. When his gaze fell upon David standing at the foot of his bed, his entire demeanor transformed. His eyes widened with a shock so profound it seemed to pierce right through the fog of his dementia. His breath caught in his throat, and his fragile hands reached out into the air between them. "David?" the old man whispered, his voice trembling with an agonizing amount of love and disbelief. "Is it really you, my boy?" The silence in the room became absolute. Sarah looked between the billionaire and the elderly man, the realization washing over her with incredible force. David stood completely paralyzed, his face turning pale as an ancient wall of pride and fear threatened to shatter. You must be mistaken, sir," David managed to choke out, his voice cracking with a raw terror he hadn't felt since childhood. "You are confusing me with someone else." "David, please," Daniel cried out, his hand reaching further, his fingers trembling violently. "I would know your mother's eyes anywhere in this world. Please, son, forgive me for what I said that night on the porch. I never meant to—" "Stop it!" David shouted suddenly, taking a sharp step backward, his face twisted in a mask of panic. "I am not your son. You are confused." He turned on his heel and fled the room, leaving Sarah completely stunned next to an old man who had collapsed back onto the pillows, weeping silently into his hands. Sarah immediately knelt beside Daniel, rubbing his shoulder gently. "Shh, it's okay, Mr. Daniel. Breathe easy, I'm right here." "It was him, Sarah," the old man sobbed brokenly. "A father never forgets the face of his own child, no matter how much time has stolen from him." Sarah felt a profound sadness settle deep into her bones. The puzzle was complete, and the truth was undeniable. The billionaire owner of this entire luxury empire had just run away from his own dying, forgotten father. Unable to let this injustice stand, Sarah left Daniel under the watchful eye of a trusted nurse and marched up to the executive floor. She bypassed the security desk with a fierce determination that left the receptionist speechless. Pushing open the heavy oak doors to David's private office, she found the billionaire slumped in his leather chair, staring blankly into the darkness of the room, looking completely defeated. "Mr. Sterling, we need to speak right now," Sarah said firmly, closing the door behind her. "Your father is downstairs asking for you, and he deserves the truth." David didn't look up, his voice reduced to a hollow whisper. "He is my father, Sarah. We broke each other's hearts 15 years ago, over a corporate merger. I wanted to sell the family assets to expand into hospitality. He called me a traitor to our employees. We screamed terrible things, and I swore I would never look back. I built all of this to prove he was wrong. But seeing him down there, broken, starving, begging for water in a hotel that I own. I realized that I didn't win anything at all. I just lost 15 years with the only family I had left. Sarah walked over to the desk, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. Then stop losing time right now, Mr. Sterling. Pride is a very lonely thing to hold on to when a person is running out of days. Your father doesn't care about your hotels or your millions. He just wants his son. You need to walk through that door and just be his boy again. David looked up at her, his eyes filled with a rare, raw vulnerability. The words of this young housekeeper carried more profound wisdom than any corporate advisor he had ever hired. He nodded slowly, the rigid walls around his heart finally beginning to crumble. I will go to him tomorrow morning, David promised quietly. I give you my word. Sarah thanked him and left the office, hoping that this promise would survive the harsh light of the coming day. The next morning, however, the heavy weight of old habits threatened to pull David back into his shell of corporate isolation. He found himself hiding behind urgent emails and international phone calls, using his immense workload as a shield against the emotional confrontation awaiting him on the third floor. Sensing his paralyzing fear, Grace stepped into his office and said softly, "Mr. Sterling, you've spent 15 years running away from this conversation. Don't let fear win today." Taking a deep breath, David finally stood up, picked up a small, weathered cardboard box from his safe, and walked toward the elevator. When he arrived on the third floor, he met Sarah, who gave him an encouraging smile. "He is having a very clear morning, David. Go inside." David stepped into the quiet room, finding his father looking out at the foggy coastline. Hearing the door open, Daniel turned around. David walked slowly to the edge of the bed and opened the cardboard box, pulling out an old, faded photograph of the two of them standing beside their first delivery truck in Ohio, both grinning widely. "I brought this, Dad," David said, his voice breaking entirely on the word he hadn't spoken in a decade and a half. Daniel took the photograph with shaking fingers, a massive sob escaping his chest as he recognized the image. "My beautiful boy," Daniel wept, reaching up to touch David's face. "I am so incredibly sorry for what I said. I was so proud of you, David. I was just too stubborn to show it." David collapsed into his father's arms, the billionaire weeping like a child, as 15 years of accumulated guilt and resentment finally washed away in a flood of tears. Meanwhile, down in the administrative offices, Samuel Fletcher had been busy conducting a malicious investigation of his own. Hoping to find a way to fire Sarah without facing David's wrath, he had uncovered the original corporate documents of the old manufacturing company David had acquired years ago. He discovered that the old man, Daniel Sterling, was actually the original founder of the core assets that started the entire Sterling empire. Realizing that he had openly insulted and tried to evict the billionaire's own father, Samuel panicked. To protect his own career, he decided to create a disgusting lie. He planned to plant a large sum of stolen resort cash in Sarah's personal employee locker, intending to frame her for corporate theft and claim that she had discovered the old man's identity beforehand and was using him to blackmail the company. What Samuel Fletcher failed to realize was that the resort had recently upgraded its security infrastructure, installing high-definition, low-light cameras throughout the employee locker rooms to combat internal shrinkage. Late that afternoon, Grace marched into David's office, her expression grim as she placed a digital tablet on his desk. "Mr. Sterling, you need to see this immediately. Our security team flagged this footage from the locker room cameras less than an hour ago." David watched the screen with an icy, dangerous fury, as the footage clearly showed Samuel sneaking into the staff-changing area, looking around nervously, and using a master key to open Sarah's locker. The manager then stuffed a thick white envelope, packed with hundreds of dollars, into her winter coat pocket, before quickly locking the door and slipping away. "He is trying to frame Sarah for theft," Grace explained, "to discredit her before she can tell you how he treated your father in the lobby." David stood up, his posture radiating a terrifying, absolute authority. "Fletcher has cross-line boundaries he cannot recover from. Call a mandatory assembly of every single staff member in the grand ballroom right now. Fire up the projectors, and make sure Samuel Fletcher is standing in the front row. Within 30 minutes, hundreds of resort employees, from housekeepers and line cooks to front desk agents, were gathered in the opulent ballroom, whispering in confusion about the sudden meeting. David walked onto the main stage, his face cast in stone, while his father Daniel sat proudly in a wheelchair in the front row, with Sarah standing gently by his side. "Thank you all for coming," David's voice boomed through the high-quality sound system. "Today, a profound injustice was attempted within the walls of this resort. For the past 2 weeks, many of you have whispered about the elderly gentleman resting in our penthouse suite. I want to state clearly and publicly that this man is Daniel Sterling, the founder of our original enterprise and my beloved father." A massive murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. David then signaled the tech booth, and the large projector screens dropped down, playing the crystal-clear security footage of Samuel Fletcher framing Sarah. The ballroom erupted into gasps of disgust as Samuel turned bright red, sweating profusely, as security guards immediately stepped up behind him. "Samuel Fletcher, you are terminated from this company effective immediately," David declared coldly, "and criminal charges for grand larceny, defamation, and corporate fraud have already been filed with the local police department, who are waiting for you in the lobby. This resort will no longer tolerate a culture where human beings are judged by their clothes, and where integrity is sacrificed for pride." The ballroom burst into a spontaneous, thunderous ovation as Samuel was led away in handcuffs. The housekeepers and cooks cheered openly, many with tears in their eyes, seeing one of their own protected so fiercely by the billionaire owner. Daniel stood up slowly from his wheelchair, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, and looked out at the gathered staff. "My son has built a magnificent empire of stone and marble," the old man said, his voice echoing with a beautiful, moral weight. "But a building is nothing but an empty shell without a soul. Sarah Harrison was the only person who saw me as a human being when I was lost in the dark. She represents the true foundation of what this company should be." Sarah wept tears of relief and gratitude as her fellow housekeepers swarmed her, offering hugs and congratulations. That evening, David promoted Sarah to the position of Director of Guest Relations and Corporate Well-Being, ensuring her a massive executive salary and comprehensive, top-tier medical benefits that would permanently secure her daughter Chloe's health and future. As the months passed into a beautiful year, the Whispering Pines Resort underwent a complete cultural transformation. Under Sarah's compassionate leadership, the property became famous not just for its luxury, but for its profound warmth and humanity. Daniel's health stabilized beautifully, his twilight months filled with the joyful laughter of his granddaughter Chloe, who loved playing among the resort's oceanfront rose gardens, while her grandfather told her stories of the old days in Ohio. The beautiful bond that had formed between David and Sarah during their darkest hour blossomed naturally into a deep, profound love, grounded in mutual respect and shared values. Exactly 1 year after the day Daniel had collapsed in the lobby, that very same space was transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of white orchids and golden candlelight for David and Sarah's wedding ceremony. The entire resort staff attended as honored guests, celebrating a union born not from corporate convenience, but from a simple, beautiful act of human kindness. When we journey far enough into the later seasons of our lives, the glittering illusions of the world begin to fade, leaving behind a profound and crystalline clarity about what truly matters. We spend the vibrant, frantic years of our youth chasing after the markers of success, building empires of stone, accumulating wealth, and protecting a fragile sense of pride that we mistake for strength. We convince ourselves that our achievements will shield us from vulnerability, creating high towers of isolation that keep the world at bay. Yet, as the hair turns to silver and the steps grow shorter, the soul realizes that the grandest empires are entirely hollow if they are not anchored by love, forgiveness, and basic human compassion. Pride is a devastatingly lonely companion. It demands that we keep our hearts hardened against those who have hurt us, locking us into decades of silence over arguments that lose all meaning when viewed through the lens of our mortality. True wealth is never found in the numbers displayed on a corporate balance sheet, or the luxury that surrounds our daily lives, but in the quiet, profound moments of reconciliation, where we choose humility over being right. It takes a lifetime to learn that the absolute highest form of intelligence in this human experience is not strategic brilliance or financial acumen, but the simple, unadorned capacity to see the dignity in another living soul, especially when that soul has been stripped of everything else by the cruel passage of time. The world is filled with individuals who have become invisible to a society obsessed with youth, speed, and efficiency. Elders who carry vast libraries of wisdom and history within their fragile frames, yet are passed by as if they were nothing more than obstacles in the road. When we extend our hands to comfort someone who is broken, disoriented, or forgotten, we are not merely performing an act of charity. We are answering a sacred calling that heals the fractures within our own hearts. Every single interaction we have with a suffering human being is a mirror reflecting the true measure of our character. A life built solely on the pursuit of self-preservation and status eventually collapses under the weight of its own emptiness, but a life enriched by spontaneous acts of love creates a legacy that time can never destroy. In the end, when the noise of the world finally grows quiet, and we look back at the long road we have traveled, we will not remember the battles we won, or the monuments we erected to our own vanity. We will remember the hands we held, the tears we dried, the family members we had the courage to forgive, and the moments we chose to treat a forgotten stranger with the deep reverence and love reserved for a king.